Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Evolving World of ADU Regulations, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM law credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is The Evolving World of ADU Regulations. You can also search for event number 9218287. So to get started today, our speaker is Donald Elliott, FAICP. Don Elliott is a director with Clarion Associates, LLC, a land use consulting firm with offices in Denver and Chapel Hill and affiliate offices in Cincinnati and Philadelphia. During his career, Don has helped more than 40 U.S. communities update their plans and regulations related to zoning, subdivision, housing, land development, and sustainability, as well as working internationally with communities in Russia, Uganda, and India. He is the author of A Better Way to Zone, co-author of The Rules That Shape Urban Form and The Citizen's Guide to Planning. He's a contributing author for Arrested Development, Combating Zombie Subdivisions and Other Excess Entitlements, and has served as the editor of Colorado Land Use Planning and Development Law for more than 25 years. He has managed planning and zoning projects that have received awards from the American Planning Association chapters in Colorado, Arizona, Indiana, New Mexico, and Pennsylvania. Don has a bachelor's degree in urban planning and policy analysis from Yale University, a law degree from Harvard Law School, and a master's degree in city and regional planning from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He teaches a graduate level course on land use regulation at the University of Colorado at Denver's School of Architecture and Planning and is a member of the City of Denver's Planning Board. Following his presentation, Don will answer as many questions as time permits, and we're expecting quite a number of them today. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So to get started, as we usually do, we're going to start with a few polls here. And the first one is going to ask everybody in the audience where you live or work. And you see the usual categories we have here: West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and International. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. If you're having trouble responding to the polls, you may need to exit from full screen mode. We do have a large crowd with us today. So thanks for joining us, and we'll leave this open for a couple of seconds so people have a chance to respond. And thanks to everybody who is doing so. As usual, we have quite a good distribution, although apparently not as many international folks as we usually do, but as a law program, that may be not surprising today. So we'll close this up, and you'll see that 36% are in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 23% in the South, and 19% in the West and Midwest, and only 2% today are international. We have 2 more poll questions for you before we turn it over to Don. We'll launch the next one here. So here is a question for you. How important are ADUs to improved housing affordability? And you can select one of these 4. Very important, moderately important, not very important, or I don't know. And we'll give you probably 20 seconds or so to respond to that. And
so given the, this is Don, but given the hotness and the warmth of this topic, it's kind of interesting how there is a split around who you ask, saying this is the most important thing since sliced bread, or you know what, it ain't going to make a difference. I'd like to know what people think before we get started.
Okay, and we'll let everybody have a couple more seconds to respond. I can see the results coming in, and I think given the attendance, we're not going to be too surprised by what we see here. 44% moderately important, 42% very important, 10% I don't know, and only 5% of our audience is not very important. So I guess we understand why everybody's here today. Then we have one last question, and that is, what is the biggest barrier to the creation of ADUs? And you can select one here: permitting and approval procedures and fees. A second, size or occupancy limits. Third is parking requirements. Fourth, design requirements. And 5, if it's not one of those, something else. And again, we'll give everybody a chance to respond. And thank Don again in advance. This is actually a record-breaking webinar for us in terms of attendance and registration. So thanks to everybody for being here on a warm July afternoon. Give you another couple seconds, and after this, we'll be turning it over to Don. Okay, so in this case, for this question, 43% permitting and approval procedures and fees, 26% something else, 13% size or occupancy limits, 12% parking, and finally 6% design requirements. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Don. So welcome to Don Elliott today.
All right, thank you very much. And that's interesting results to me. I'm intrigued in seeing those results. So I have shared screen. Can you confirm which screen you're seeing?
This is not the correct one, Don. You're
all right, and I'm not saying sorry about that, but I'm going to have to turn it off. And where is I have not seen the presenter view portion of this. So where can I find the proper screen on here? I'm trying.
So
I do not have
you'll have to select when you get the prompt, you have to pick the one that is showing your PowerPoint.
I'm not seeing the prompt though. It says my point is that. Have you got that going there now?
Still on the wrong screen, Don.
All right.
Don, go to share screen, drop screen down. The word screen has a drop down, then select the PowerPoint or screen 2. Maybe you want to select screen 2.
All right, I will have to do that, but I'm not seeing where to do that. I apologize, okay. But
under the sharing tab.
Yep.
You'll see show screen, right?
Yep.
A screen
drop down.
Screen is a drop down. And then you should be able to select screen 2.
Tell me whether or not that's right now.
No, that's still screen 1, I guess.
All right, then we'll go and then we'll do. I'm sorry, we'll do this.
There you go. Although I think, yeah, that looks good. Thank you.
All right. Apologies to everybody. That's always the hardest part of the day. So let's get going. We got a lot to cover here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction. I do want to talk about, I just want to give a little bit of background. Why have you signed up to do this? This is what I do for a living. I'm a lawyer and planner, and I write development codes. I help cities around the country say, okay, our plan says we want to do X, our housing policy says we want to do Y, and our laws are just not aligned with it. And so over the years, over the 25 years or so, we've worked in over 200 communities and done about 220 of these things. And we have worked in Maryland and a couple of places, Prince George's County and Howard County, and maybe others as well over the course of a long time. Why? I'm gonna move quickly because I know we're gonna have a lot of questions and there's a lot to cover in this topic. Why? Well, you can see this by the picture is illustrative, but basically it's a hot topic. There is a significantly rising curve of applications for ADUs. Everywhere I've looked in the cities that are considering this topic, the numbers are going up, and they're going up, frankly, rapidly. They're not in the thousands, but in their hundreds of years hundreds per year for large cities. And the whole point is, A, it's hot. A majority of people on this call think it's important, and we should be doing more about it. Those of you who are on the call also know that if you say these words, you will be accused of threatening the American dream. My house on my lot by myself is why I bought it here, because that's what it means, and that's their conception of the American dream. And basically, the bottom bullet is it differs very widely. You will see, and I'll probably say 2 or 3 times in this presentation, there's no way to actually summarize this, because like zoning, like all kinds of regulations around the United States, it would be surprising to find 2 cities or counties that do it together. This is rapidly evolving. I'm going to hit some highlights and things and trends that I think are significant. But frankly, we're new at this. We've only been doing it for 10 or 15 years. Ironically, we used to do it very well. After World War II, the GI Bill some loans were only available if you did a spare room for someone returning from the war who could rent that room. It is not un-American, but the point is, we used to take this more or less in stride. Somewhere after World War II in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it became identified as being only my house on my lot with the American dream. And so as we are reinventing this and figuring it out, it's easy to overdo it and underdo it. And a lot of cities and counties are in the process of saying, let's see how this works for a while and then see what we want to do different. Here's what I'd like to cover. What are they? Very briefly, many of you know. What impacts do cities and counties think they need to regulate? And that differs a lot. How have they been regulated? What are the poison pills that discourage ADUs? How have those regulations been changing over time? And then what are the equity impacts of the different approaches that you might take? So just to get right into it, what are ADUs? Well, again, I can tell by the number of people and the number of people who answered the poll. Many of you know this, but some do not. With this many people, there are going to be some folks who think the name is neat and they've heard it and they're trying to learn more. It's an accessory use of land. It is, by its nature, secondary and subordinate to a permitted primary use of land. That's important in zoning geek speak. That means it is something you're allowed to do because you are doing something else primary with the use of land. It is not the primary use of land. It is not as important or as fundamental to the character of the area as the primary use of land. Subordinate often means it's smaller, but not always. If you get into an agricultural zone, the house could be small, the barn could be big, but that barn is an accessory to the fact that you're living on the property. So subordinate doesn't always mean smaller. And in many codes, these are distinguished between internal and attached, meaning a basement, an attic, a garage, where you finally moved out all that junk that we see in the picture and said, you know what, honey, we could get rid of all this stuff, give it to Goodwill and turn this into a living unit. Or they're external, detached, freestanding. There are other words used for this, but that's a fundamental difference. It's inside the envelope of the current house, or it's outside the envelope of the current house. Surprisingly, there is no consensus on which of those is more acceptable. It depends on politics and the context. But it's generally created through construction or conversion of an internal attic, basement, garage, or a detached garage or carriage house. If I don't have a garage, could I build a detached ADU in my backyard? Yes. Often it is a conversion of a garage or a second floor in a garage. That's detached. So for those who are wondering, what does this mean? That's what it means. And so here's some sample definitions. The bad news about this presentation is you're going to see a lot of words on the screen. The good news is I'm not going to read all the words. I'm going to try to highlight the reason why I put it up there. So these are from 3 different cities. A subordinate dwelling added to, created within, etc., but located on the same lot or parcel and providing basic requirements for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. That's one definition. Second one says an attached dwelling unit that is accessory in character and, in this case, lesser in size and character to the principal building, otherwise satisfies requirements. So in this community, number 2, you can't do a detached. They define it as attached. It must be within the envelope of your home. And there are a number of communities that do that. And finally, the third one is separate living quarters. And in this case, they include in the definition the space issue containing 800 square feet of floor area or less, excluding, etc., providing that no recreational vehicle or similar movable vehicle shall be an accessory dwelling unit. So those are just samples to say they all talk about subordination in terms of size, lesser in size and character, but again, or accessory subordinate. The whole point is this is the small deal, guys. It is part of a lot that includes a big deal. And this just gives you a sample of what people do and do not address in their definitions of ADUs. So one thing to remember is that in almost every community, unless you do not have a building or zoning code in your community, they are required to meet residential building codes. That means either the manufactured housing code or the building code. I put this slide up because we get this question all the time. Can a tiny house be an ADU? Yes, if you say so, it could, but it has to meet one of those building safety codes. Well, I built one and I think it's pretty good. Probably not. And almost everywhere it has to be mounted on a permanent foundation and connected to water, sewer, and electric utilities. By the way, if you go around the country and read development codes and say, I don't see the word tiny house on here. Answer, it's not there. Most of the times, a tiny house is just a small house. If it meets the building code, it's a house. If it doesn't meet the building code, it's not a house. And if it meets the building code and it's small, it is no different than an old 600 square foot or 400 square foot house that you could have built back in the day. So if you're looking for this in codes, most of the time you don't find it. But bottom line is, this is important. They all have to meet building, fire, and safety codes, almost without exception. So let's talk about the potential impacts to be regulated. Why are we having this session? Because there's a lot of regulation going out there. And this, I want to talk a little bit about the policy debate going in, because you don't get to the weeds, to what you can and can't do and where you can and can't do it until you get through this gate called the policy debate. Is this a no-brainer form of general density that would only unreasonable people would object to? Or is it a doubling of density of single-family zones and the American dream as we know it? You will hear, I used to say that there are only two types of communities, those that have fought the chicken wars and those that will fight the chicken wars about chickens in the backyard. Say the same thing here. There are probably only two types of communities, those who have fought the ADU battle one way or the other, and those who will in the future. And when you tackle it, you will find that the words, this is doubling our density, comes out in about the first 30 seconds of the debate. So which of these goes on? So if you're on the pro side, and it sounds like a majority of the people on this webinar are, this is what you say. They're smaller and more affordable. We need to use every available tool to promote affordability. I generally agree with the second part of that. Are ADUs the only solution? No, of course they're not. Are they a part of the puzzle? Yeah, I think they are. And the bottom line is our affordability crisis in housing is so serious that the moment you try to say, well, I like this solution better than that solution, you're probably half a step behind, because you're going to have to try many solutions and you have to try many things to change in order to make traction against a serious economic problem. So they're fair, because single family neighborhoods, especially rich ones, should not be exempted from contributing to the affordable housing solution. Whose issue is this? It's an economic issue of the United States of America. It is how we've run our economy, which makes housing more and more unaffordable to more and more people. That's not my problem, and it's not your problem. It is all our problem. We all live in this economy. And the fairness argument is, and give me a reason again why you should be exempt from contributing to this, because I'm not sure. 3, they can help poor residents stay in their homes, providing an additional source of rental income, and they allow aging in place. You could move out of the main house, move into your ADU, rent the big one, and there's part of your retirement. But here are the cons arguments, and there are cons for every pro argument. They're not always smaller or more affordable. Their construction's expensive. The unit will be expensive. I just finished a term on the Denver Planning Board where in the last 2 or 3 years, we had a very rapidly increasing volume of ADU applications for rezoning. And that was about the first objection that the neighbors made. You guys say this is affordable housing, but it ain't gonna be affordable. They're expensive. And that means the rent will be expensive. That means you're imposing on my solitude and my lot for a unit that will not, in fact, be affordable. They're not fair because many single family neighborhoods are not rich. Their residents have fought hard to buy in a less crowded neighborhood, i.e. don't start doing this based on paradigms of whether people who live in single family detached zone districts are rich or poor. They're both. Poor people cannot afford. Their answer to help poor residents stay in their homes and say they're not going to be able to build them, so they'll sell out and the area will gentrify. Somebody will build one, but it won't be the person who lives there now because they don't have the money to do it. And finally, they allow aging in place, and the answer is that'd be kind of rare. It's a hypothetical. It's kind of cool. You could point to examples, but it's also just as likely they'll sell the whole property and move to another property. So yeah, in the neighborhood or otherwise. So I want to be clear here. Many planners, an increasing number of cities come down on the pro side. That's why you're all here. And here are the major reasons, but my next slide is going to go into the con. So I'm going to be clear. I'm not giving you my answer. I do come down on this side of it, but it's not a slam dunk. Single family neighborhoods often make up more than 50%. I was on a call yesterday where somebody said they make up 80% of our land area, of urban land. And so not allowing ADUs in SF neighborhoods means trying to increase affordability using half of your land. It's like, wow, tying one hand behind your back. Guys, this is, I think, an extraordinarily compelling argument. We have a very serious problem. And fairness, let's put fairness out to the side. Any solution that says we're going to try to solve this problem while only dealing with 40%, 30%, 50% of our land and let the others go, you really got to scratch your head and say, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to solve a very complicated problem with half of the arrows in your quiver? Secondly, there's a general support for supply side thinking. Although supply alone cannot solve the affordability problem, it is hard to see how the affordability problem gets tackled without increasing supply. It is hard to answer that question. Yes, supply is not affordable, but restricting supply is almost guaranteed not to make things better. So, and finally, exempting SFD neighborhoods feels like a use of land use laws to defend privilege. I'm going to say this a few times. We have an equity session in here. It's current. You need to deal with it because that's going to come up in the policy debate about this. Are we simply, is our reluctance to allow these simply a defensive privilege? Or is it have the unintended effect, even though we don't intend it, unintended effect of defending current patterns of privilege in this country, of which, if so, okay, if that's what you're intending to do, but if that's not what you're intending to do, then you got to scratch your head a little longer. So the con arguments are pretty strong. Here's one that I think is also compelling. People all over the world, even in poor countries, live in single family only neighborhoods, and there's nothing inherently bad about it. Now, I am stating the con side of this argument. I actually think this is pretty compelling. All over the world, people strive to live on a house and a lot by themselves. In some places, it is harder to do because they're more crowded and the government has said you can't do this, it's a bad use of land. But this idea that there's something quote unquote evil about single family zoning on single lots, I think is also a head scratcher. Wow, I guess that means that the yearnings of much of the world, all over the world of every income level are wrong. I'm hereby labeling them wrong. That's a dubious proposition. And so the idea that you start the thing saying this, we should not have this, is an uphill battle because it appears to be globally widespread and supported as a style of life that people aspire to. Supply side thinking, the con argument is it's not working very well. Hey, we've been adding supply for a long time and the prices are not coming down. I've put on the screen that cover of Six City by Patrick Condon in Vancouver. Interesting book that's available on the web. I don't think it's even printable. It's just free download. And it's a very, I'm not going to go into it, but his argument is basically supply side thinking won't get us out of this, basically. In fact, what happens when you add density or allow property to build more units is that the owner of the land captures the value. It doesn't wind up in the affordability of the project. That's not a crazy argument. And finally, the last one is it's not defending privilege. Your own income equality figures show that the majority of these neighborhoods cannot be occupied by the rich. Hey, if you say that income inequality means only 10, 20, 30% of us are making it and 60% are struggling, Well, and you also said that most of the land in our communities is single family zoning. A lot of those are occupied by lower and middle income families. What's defending privilege about that? We're defending the character of neighborhoods that are enjoyed by people of all income strata except the very poor. So those are the con arguments, and I'm stating them because they're not crazy. They're not crazy arguments. So here, let's go on. What needs to be regulated? And here's a long list. Can you only do them a single family dwelling? Only one? Can it only be internal, only external? Do you need to get a special permit or zoning? Do we limit the size of the unit? Do we limit the size of the lot? Say you have to have a minimum size. Who can live in it? Do they have to be poor? Does the owner of the property have to live in one of the two units? I'm going to use that word owner occupancy throughout the presentation. It means not that the person in the ADU has to own it. It means a very common regulation is the owner of the lot, of the house in the lot, has to live in one of the two units on that lot. They can't be living in Aruba and renting them both out. You have to have parking. Are we going to are we going to regulate architectural design, meaning no visible entrance, no change from the look of a house? That's the screen here. It clearly looks different than a house, the screenshot. Are we going to say you can't divide it from a single family dwelling? Are we going to say you can use it for a short-term rental? And are we going to make you get separate water tap and sewer tap and pay the fees related to it? Lots of issues here, guys, and they're all over the map in terms of how they're done. I'm going to give you some summary statements about what we have been doing and how often, and then talk about, give you some examples, so I'm not going to read them. I'm going to try to go through them. Are they only available to single family dwelling? Yeah, that's almost universal. There's a slow change towards allowing them in 2-family and 3-family, but 90% or more of the ordinance out there say, hey, we're talking about a secondary unit in a single family house, not a secondary unit in each of 2 houses that are duplexes or triplexes or fourplexes. 1 per SFT, almost universal. California is the exception. I'm not going to talk about state law today. Everybody on this call, many are probably aware of the steps that Oregon has taken, Minnesota has taken, and California has taken, and others. But California, a couple of years ago and recently has amended it, has basically said you need to allow 2 ADUs per single family lot, 1 inside and 1 outside. Now that's an overstatement of a complex law, but that's what they're trying to do. So when I say 1 per lot, there is a state with about 40 million people in it that has said, wait, scratch that 1 and put 2. And obviously it's very contentious in California. There are lots of people trying not to do it, but the rule is generally 1. Is it only internal or only external? Most codes allow both, but it's kind of interesting. If you allow only 1 of the 2, it is kind of an even split. Some say internal, we get it. We just hate the idea of you having people living in a separate structure. Others are, we're fine with you converting the garage. We just don't want to have many more people in your building envelope. So there's a split there. Do you need an individual rezoning or special permit? Not that many require a rezoning these days. Permits are some sort of non-administrative permit. When I say a permit, I mean a permit that staff can issue if you meet the code. I don't consider that. A special permit means you need to go through some sort of a hearing or a discretionary review or a rezoning, which is usually a discretionary review. There are not that many. My hometown, Denver here, is in the exception. We require a rezoning to do it, but that's not the norm in most of the ordinances I've read around the country. Maximum size of the unit, yep, most of them have maximum size, and but they range terrifically from 400 square feet to 1,500 square feet, or increasingly people are saying, yeah, well, it doesn't make any sense to split your attic or basement. You can do the whole attic or basement. Minimum size of the lot. I think less than half the ordinances I've looked have said you can only do this on a lot of 5,000 square feet or more, etc. There are some. There are a number, and there are others that say, depending on the size of your lot, we will calibrate the maximum size of your ADU. We don't want a huge ADU on a small lot. But it tends to have a perverse incentive. This is the funny thing, is that it tends to force ADUs onto larger properties, and the larger properties in most American cities are farther out. So they're further from transit, and it takes the odds on you living near your job or your school or the things you do for a day-to-day basis get lower as you move farther out, because the distances involved are greater and the lots are greater. So it tends to have a bit of a perverse incentive in that it pushes something that is often needed for houses that need to be near transit, near jobs, near schools, things that they need to be able to access quickly, meaning for income reasons. That's the only way they can make it. So, well, you can't do ADUs here. It could protect older neighbors with smaller lots from speculative investment. You could say, hey, you got to have a minimum lot size. I call that bottom picture naturally occurring affordable housing. It's probably affordable today. It could not be replicated at the costs that people are paying right now to rent or buy that. And the answer is, if those lots are too small for ADUs and they can't do ADUs, well, it could say, well, then we're not going to have anybody buying that to add an ADU and raise the rent for it. Can't be divided or sold apart from an ADU, single family dwelling, almost universal so far. There's a good bit of rumbling out there in public debate about why. I mean, we could all point to corners of lots that have been divided. So there's a house facing Main Street and a house that's facing First Street on what used to be one lot. We don't know when it happened, 40s, 50s, but it happened. That's not terrible. It's a smaller house on the back of what used to be the backyard. And why are we stopping that now? Why are we not doing that? But it is still almost universal. You know, the counter argument is, once you divide it into two lots, in what way is the second one subordinate to the first one? It's not. It's a house on a lot. It's just smaller than the other house, but they're owned by different people, and they're controlled by different people. They're occupied by different people. So it does, but when you do this, what you're saying is, we're saying the ADUs are not a way to build equity. So that comes up again and again. Are we trying to provide housing supply? Option A, these are a source of housing supply. Option B, we're doing this because we want more affordable housing supply. Option C, we want to allow people to reach the bottom rung on the home ownership ladder. So we want them to be able to buy and sell these, because that's how you make money and a retirement in America. Those are three different goals that different communities have gone to. If you're into building equity, you want to argue for the ability to subdivide these things. Owner occupancy of one of the units is almost universal so far. I'll talk more about that so far. The basic reason is, well, it's subordinate. The guy is your tenant. You can tell him to stop having parties. You can tell him to stop parking where he's not supposed to park. And there is a different feel about a person that is beholden to, in some way, their landlord on the property, as opposed to somebody who is not. Who can live in the ADU? Those are declining, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Pretty few these days. You still see rural codes where counties have said, yeah, it has to be an elderly or an infirm person, because that's what we did. It first came up because, you know, Joe's mother-in-law needed a place to live and they wanted to keep an eye on her, so we let them have it, but only for that. And those are declining very quickly. Those are really hard to enforce. That's another theme of today's presentation. If you're trying to enforce who can live in this unit, you got an uphill battle. And you can do it. It's just that it's very intrusive and often politically very unpopular. Income level. Right now, not very many places forcing ADUs or requiring them to have income levels. I'll talk about an exception. Parking is very common. Yes, you have to have a parking space. Architectural design, not much. I would say a quarter of them that I've looked at, a fifth, say, look, it can't look any different than a house. But many ordinances out there don't say that anymore. Those are the two common ones. You can't have a second entrance facing the street. Short-term rental or not is a huge concern. I believe, and I would be happy to be contradicted or to be informed, when I look at ADU ordinances, many of them don't mention STRs at all, STR meaning short-term rentals. And many STR ordinances don't mention ADUs. So by not prohibiting them, I think in many cases they are. But short-term rental regulations are even newer than ADU regulations. And so both of these are rapidly evolving. Those who believe they should include the fact that it's very hard to enforce otherwise, but also that will increase housing supply. Okay, Don can't afford to do it, or Don can only afford to build one if he can short-term rent. He can pay off the mortgage or the construction loan faster if he can get more money quicker by renting it for shorter periods of time. That means we've added an ADU that Don could not have afforded to build if we did not allow him to do an STR. That's the argument. The secondary argument is, wow, you thought it was hard before. We have a hard time enforcing short-term rental regulations in primary structures. Now we're going to try to enforce them in accessory structures. So, and finally, separate utilities and fees seems to be a 50-50 split. Half the jurisdiction saying you may not have a separate water and sewer tap because that would only encourage you to, in the future, try to sell the property separately. And others saying you must, because our whole system is calibrated on everybody paying their fair share for water and sewer. And who are you to not be included in that? You're helping to pay our capital costs because you are tapping into our water and sewer system. I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to read these. You may read them at your leisure. I'm going to highlight some of the quintessential things, some of the things that happen. And I'm underlining the square footage because you'll see how much it varies, not only lot size, but square footage of the units that are permitted. Here's an unusual provision. And again, I'm not intending to point examples at anybody. We could have had a day of putting these on the screens, and I don't want to do that. These are just examples that were in my files that were easy to find based on our experience. Some require private common space provided for each accessory dwelling unit. Each dimension in the common space has to be 10 feet, meaning, okay, it's another unit. You're going to have more space, or at least this much space to know that the people have a place to be outside as well as inside. Fairfax County, I'm going to give 2 or 3 examples where we work. In Fairfax County, it has to be wholly contained within the structure of a single family. They vote for internal. This was recently a subject of hot debate in Fairfax County. They approved a new code, and you can see what's going on. Whoops, I guess that'll move on to the next example. They have a system where some of these go through administrative permit and some go through a special permit. You can see the size limits down at the bottom there. They also limit bedrooms, and they limit the occupancy number of this. And then they say, remember the last slide said 800 square feet. This one says 1,200 if you get a special permit. So you can do more if you go to a discretionary process. The BZA may approve a special permit for accessory living in a freestanding structure, but only on a lot of at least 2 acres. Now, this was, again, a very hot topic in Fairfax County. Staff recommended getting rid of that 2-acre recommendation. Originally, there was a lot of pushback on it, but I want to be clear, this was a debate. This was a debate. It's not as if they walked in the door saying, we want to keep this, but it stayed. Columbia, Missouri has regulations saying, here's one example of you can only do it on a lot that meets these minimum square foot requirements. And here's one that says minimum of 1 additional off-street parking space should be provided for ADUs if you have not more than 2 bedrooms, but 2 additional parking spaces if you have 3 or more bedrooms. So we have the previous example saying thou shalt not have more than 2 bedrooms. This one says, well, you could. You're just going to have to provide more parking for it. Albany. So for the purpose of providing fire protection, the distance from the nearest street frontage to the center of the rear wall of the accessory shall not exceed 150 feet of travel distance. That's the distance of a fire hose. So here's one that instead of relying on the fire code to review it, kind of said, look, we don't want these where they can't be served by the fire department. Here's an example of one that says, we don't want 2 front doors facing the street. So you get the idea. I'm not reading all of these. Every community sorts through these topics and comes out at something that is a compromise based on neighborhood values and the politics of the situation. Here's Norfolk, Virginia. Here's one that says it'll also maintain the architectural design, style, appearance, and character of the principal dwelling by incorporating elements, compatible materials, similar facade treatments, colors, window style treatment, roof design, and pitch. So again, an example of one that says, and if you look above, exterior stairways are a no-no. Here's Middlesex County, basically saying shall be constructed and styled. This is another internal example. 2 parking spaces shall be required in addition to that required for the business use. Now, this picture, which you saw on the first slide, is an ADU that's about a block from my house. I tried to scratch my head and said, you know, that's pretty hard to do. 2 parking spaces for an ADU. Well, this one has one under the deck, and you can see the back of the black car on the left, that's parked beside the street. So they did it. It can be done. This is an older neighborhood. This is an accessory dwelling unit. You can imagine a lot of properties that could not accommodate 1 additional car, much less 2 additional cars. Here's Denver's. I want to be clear. Denver mapped areas with existing ADUs when it comprehensively mapped in 2010, and then you have to go for an individual rezoning. That was a compromise. People feel strongly about we shouldn't have them at all, and others feel we should have them everywhere. This was the compromise. But I do want to point out Denver has a form-based code, and they actually say in the second part, we have a form. We have an detached accessory dwelling unit building form standards. So Denver defines building forms, and they define a detached ADU building form. They also, if you look at the graphic, it is a tandem house. That's what I was describing earlier. Somewhere in the past, a lot was divided into two, and there are two lots where we would normally expect to see one, and Denver says in its form-based code, you can't do an ADU in that situation. That's a thing. A tandem house is a type of development. We have defined it, and you can't do an ADU in that context. So they generally allow rezonings, but the form-based code takes a form-based approach to the fabric within which you can do it and the form of the building that you need to do if you're doing an attached ADU. Again, I want to just highlight, again, this is another example. Roof and exterior walls and finishes for a detached structure shall be comparable in composition and appearance to the primary single. So they also, my city, also reviews the look and feel of the ADU. So, and again, wherever feasible, water and sewer shall be supplied to both the primary single unit dwelling and the accessory unit. Single taps and electric or gas utility shall be supplied through a single meter. This is, there are two reasons why people do this. A, because it can significantly reduce the cost of the ADU. The second reason is, well, if you're all on a single tap, we're not going to wake up one day and find that you've tried to sell this thing through some chicanery, and that, yeah, you didn't split the lot, but this guy's waving a deed that says he owns the back half of the lot in his house, and hey, you have de facto tried to subdivide a lot. You're not likely to do that when the guy is going to have to turn off his own water and sewer in order to turn it off to you or not have you billing for it. So that's the other reason people do it. So I just will repeat, you will find as many variations of how we regulate as you will find cities and counties that have done regulation. There are times when I write development codes where I can look at one and look at an LED for signs, LED regulations, and say, that's pretty typical. I can look at a whole variety of things, like, that's kind of what people are doing these days. ADUs are not in that category. But the list of moving parts that you can decide to exercise, to not exercise, to limit, to emphasize, to reward is, again, what's the factorial of the 11 points I gave you before? There are as many combinations as there are types of things you can think of. Now, let's talk about poison pills, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the general trends and how people are changing this. I've told you what people are doing. We'll get on after this to what people are changing as they do this. So, what are the poison pills? The answer, by the way, that's Socrates drinking hemlock. That's the best I could do for a poison pill. The answer to the question depends a bit on how badly you want to promote ADUs. Every barrier is not a poison pill. Everything you do in real estate or in zoning that makes it more difficult or more expensive or limits where you can do it or how big it can be or who can live in it, every one of those things raises costs or limits the value, which has the effect of saying, well, I'm not going to do it then if I can only rent it to two people. That's too narrow a market for me to do. I'm not going to do that. So every regulation in land use has some effect on price, and we're here to talk about price, talk about affordability. So if you define poison pill as anything that would prevent Sam from deciding to pursue an ADU, then everything is a poison pill. I don't buy it that way. I think poison pill are the things that are important, that people who work in the field have said are fundamental to getting ADUs to happen. So I've put together 3. They come out of articles and presentations that I have participated in or read, and then a short list. So with apologies to Nike, if advocates list is the group of people like, just do this. Why are we wrapping ourselves around the axle? It's sensible, it's important, do it. Remove things that stop it from happening. And one of the articles I've read about what I would view to be an advocate is owner occupancy requirements, minimum parking requirements, limits on who can live in it, and another version of that is age and disability requirements, limits on how many people can live in it, maximum size limits on the ADU, and in this person's opinion, limiting ADUs that existed when the ordinance was adopted, I'm sorry, that's a typo. Limiting to ADUs on single family homes that exist when the ordinance is adopted. Again, that last bullet should have said, some ordinances say, hey, to prevent speculation, to prevent people buying up naturally occurring affordable housing, to put an ADU on it and driving up the price and driving the current tenant out, we're going to say you can only do it on a house that is already existing. We will not let you tear down the house and build a new house and a new ADU. So that should take some of the speculative gas out of the engine. So that is in this person's list. Their list of poison pills was all of these things. Here's a contractor. See the image of the contractor truck. Owner occupancy requirements, minimum parking requirements. Those are the first two on the last list as well. Bulk claims. This is a builder. This is a person who tries to do it and says, this example actually comes from a city that has bulk planes and small lots. And in order to avoid your ADU overshadowing your neighbor's backyard, they have bulk plane. And this contractor's opinion is, you've just made it really weird. In order to comply with your thou shalt not shadow your neighbor requirement, I have to build a weird house. And that's expensive. A box is the cheapest thing to build. Something that doesn't involve strange angles and obtuse angles is easier to build, is harder to build. In addition, this contractor's opinion was, and this city example says, if we find that your alley or your curbs are substandard, then we routinely say that the permission of your constructing, forget ADUs, even a single family house, is you're going to fix the curb. You're going to fix, this is what everybody does. The city can't go through, doesn't have the money or the time to go through and fix every curb that is done. So when you ask to redevelop your property and reconfigure it, we actually attach a little thing on the end that says, oh, and you'll fix the curb or you'll fix the alley. In this case, there's some cases where somebody said the alley is substandard, you can do it, but you're going to have to widen your part of the alley. And this contractor said that is an incredible burden on somebody who's trying to do affordable housing. Just don't do it. Just admit that sometimes the curb doesn't get fixed. Banning STRs. And here's a quote. Most ADUs would not be built if they could not be used for STRs, meaning they are either, depending on where you live, where you come down, a tool that's feeding speculation because I can make more money. I can make this pencil out as an investment if I can have a short-term rental in the ADU, or I can stay in here and live in it, but pay it off faster if I can do short-term rentals, or you don't want them at all. So here's a shorter list. This is mine. And it's nobody's opinions but mine, but it's shorter. I think minimum parking requirements are a big problem. They disqualify most of the older housing stock on small lots. And, basically the whole point of ADUs is to increase the ability to use existing residential lots and properties to house more people. It kind of is, it's inconsistent. It's the tail wagging the dog. Rezoning and non-administrative permit requirements, not only time, expense, and predictability, but the fact that you're going to have a fight with your neighbors, or at least risk a fight with your neighbors. And that's not a pleasant thing. Many people will walk away right then. I'm going to have to do a public hearing. I'm out of here. And finally, requiring new utilities and tap connections for the reason I said before. It's expensive. It's very expensive. Are you trying to make this more affordable or less affordable? I do understand that utility and tap fees and connections are very complicated and controversial. I do also think that in many cities, they're out of date because they assume that a house is a house is a house. And the answer is no, we can think harder than that as to who should need to pay these and how we allocate the capital costs of our operating costs over different types of housing. So it's kind of a self-imposed problem. We don't want to change the way we think about infrastructure in order to promote affordable housing. That's a bad way to think about it. Finally, how are the regulations changing? Here's a quote from an author, one of the reports I've read. Recognizing the regulations of banning or restricting construction serve little or no public health or safety purpose and are of significant barriers, municipalities are amending them. I believe that is a true statement. I've used the white bread to tell a story. I was touring Europe years and years and years ago, and I walked into a cathedral that boasted that they had just cleaned up 400 or 500 years of candle wax and soot, and it used to be very dark, and it is now brilliantly light, and they didn't use any chemicals. Answer, and I stupidly, they set me up, and I said, so what did you use? And they said, white bread. We pushed it. We took a year or 2 years. We had contractors put the white bread up against the soot and the wax and the grime of the centuries, and it gets absorbed in the white bread. And then we threw the white bread away and we had a clean cathedral. Now, I use that just to say, as communities feel the pressure to respond to ADUs, they're kind of thinking in terms of white bread. What do we not need? That's not intended to be a pejorative statement. You could use rye bread or pumpernickel bread. You know, what do we not need? And by analogy, the first round of wireless communication regulations were very complicated. As people rethink them, they think this is actually a lot easier than we thought. The first round of chickens in the backyard regulations were pretty complicated. Second round was saying, you know what, there are not as many issues here as we thought there were. Same thing with ADUs. As a general statement, they're getting more flexible because people are looking at saying, what do we not need to regulate here? So here's my trends. Fewer restrictions on who can occupy an ADU. Here's some examples. If people think I got my facts wrong, please correct me. I could have given more examples, could have researched more, I suppose. But Seattle removed the owner occupancy requirement. Vancouver, Portland don't require over occupancy. West Hartford, Connecticut used to say that these were limited to guests of the owner and household workers. That went away. Fairfax County has repealed requirements the occupants be elderly or disabled. Fewer ordinances require a separate parking space. Seattle removed parking. Portland, Vancouver, Burnaby, Denver do not require parking. Santa Barbara County removed the parking requirement. I have to have fun here for just a minute. This is parking congestion. This is not parking congestion, despite some of my neighbors' comments that it is. This is what people are worried about. They're worried about front yard parking. They're worried a little bit about street parking, although, to be honest, I made a point when we get to this parking argument every time on ADUs, and I actually made a point of driving around neighborhoods at the end, in the beginning of the day, to say how much of the streets are occupied in these neighborhoods. And the answer is, it's very rare that they're parked up. So people are worried about it. They're worried about front yard parking. That's legitimate. Fewer restrictions on home occupations in ADUs. This is actually my colleague here at Clarion, but she's pretending to be a home occupation because this is what most home occupations are these days. They're working on the web or they're working in an office. So Fairfax County allows in some. Portland allows non-client serving home occupations. Vancouver does not allow ADUs in homes with home occupations. So you can have a choice in Vancouver. You can have a home occupation or an ADU. It's a matter of, are we going to have, when you say I have an ADU, more people are going to be coming and going from your property every day. When we say you can have a home occupation, that's more people. Are we going to allow both of those at the same time? That's the question. And it's actually fairly complicated. Fairfax County wrestled with this some time ago to say, okay, we got 3 moving parts: childcare in the home, home occupation, and short-term rentals. What combinations of these things are we going to allow? It's hard to sort out. Woodland Park, Colorado allows a home occupation in the primary single family or the ADU, but not both. You choose. You're going to run a business or your tenant's going to run a business, but not both. Denver allows it both. Those are getting more liberal. And frankly, home occupation standards are just changing rapidly around the country because of the impacts and because it is so hard to enforce in terms of most of the types of businesses people run. We're seeing more text amendments. This is an example from Chafee Park. The vague outline there is to allow ADUs in more zoning districts and more area-wide rezonings. This is something that came through just a month or so ago, where the city councilwoman promoted this. And as a result of taking not just into, as I told you earlier, normally people would have to come in one at a time and get rezoned for ADUs. This is 1,400 homes, which now have the ability to do ADUs. They removed from a district that didn't allow them to a district that does allow them. I should say, in all fairness, although we're seeing more of this, I would say and there are a lot of people talking about it. Like we have a lot of plans adopted that say we want our whole neighborhood rezoned for ADUs, and we have other neighborhoods that say we don't. We also have had pretty eloquent testimony from another city councilman in Denver who said, you know what? My district has naturally occurring affordable housing. If you do this, I will not do this, because if I did this, every one of those would be, not everyone, many would be bought by speculators and the existing tenants would sell out. It would be gentrified. So we have almost diametrically opposed views of the merit of this tool. How are they changing? Once again, short-term rentals, Spokane, Washington, Vancouver allow short-term rentals and ADUs. Boulder limits them to a certain number of days a year. Denver allows them if the owner occupies the single-family dwelling. So normally in Denver, you can rent your house. And if you get an ADU, you can rent the ADU and you can rent the house. But if you do a short-term rental in the ADU, you must live in the house, is how it goes. There are more programs being operated to say if we sell this based on affordability, we have to solve a problem, which is that the people who most need them can't afford them. So Seattle passed a bunch of amendments in 2019 with several different assistance programs. The West Denver Renaissance Collaborative, headed by my friend Renee Martinez-Stone, has got a set of programs that helps moderate and low income qualified homeowners, to design, finance, and build ADUs on their own property. It's a way of trying to find the technical assistance and the financial assistance to help the people who we say we would like to help build these so they don't have to move and they don't sell out to a speculator, but do it themselves so that their income can keep them in their neighborhood and their house. And then obviously they pass what they learn onto the city through a process of just consultation on, look, this is a problem. Others, Snohomish County amended its ordinance to allow ADUs on substandard lots. Santa Barbara amended its ADU ordinance to reduce permitting process to 60 days. They reduced it from a higher number. Chicago has made a bunch of amendments recently that require a percentage of ADUs to be affordable at defined levels. So that's the exception to the rule. They've kind of they've changed a bunch of things to make it more available, and they have 5 areas of Chicago that this is being tried in, but they're also doing a test. They're limiting ADUs in some areas to 2 per block per year for a 3-year trial period to see what happens. So that's another change. Raleigh removed the requirement to obtain overlay zoning for an ADU, i.e. they needed a rezoning. They no longer need a rezoning. Seattle have adopted pre-approved ADU plans to say you walk in with this type of an ADU based on that type of a typical garage or that type of a typical structure. And we say, yes, we're not, it's a quick approval. You're using Plan 4. Okay, we already said Plan 4 is fine on that kind of a lot. Go pull a building permit. What are the equity impacts? I'm going to try to wind up so we can do more time for questions. Let me see how I'm doing time-wise. Got to rush a little bit. Well, this is complex, and it's a major topic that's been discussed. I already talked about the pro and con policy arguments. I'm going to talk a little bit about equity, and I usually get in trouble for saying some of the things I'm going to say, but I'll say them anyway. So we're having this discussion because we want housing to be more affordable. That's what it's about. We are not intending to feed speculation. That is a source of housing supply. Very few elected officials would stand up and say, you know what, I think speculators drive our city development and I want to see more of it. The point of the conversation is to try to see if we can expand the supply of something we believe to be more affordable than what we're producing today, and to have the impacts of that change spread evenly over a large area of the city rather than concentrated in a few areas. That's why we're having this conversation. So who has fewer choices and options in America? Well, it's lower income populations. But be careful. The reason this is hard is the lower income populations may be those looking to move into a neighborhood who can't afford the housing, and they could afford an ADU. But it could also be lower income people who are living in naturally occurring affordable housing and are scared to death that what you're going to do is going to lead their landlord to raise the rent and drive them out. So the lower income equity impacts turn a little bit on whether these are lower income neighborhoods that are trying to stabilize and be that way, as opposed to other neighborhoods that do not have much of a low income population, but could accommodate lower income folks. And lower income in America is significantly correlated with households headed by persons of color, women, and the disabled, and others. And again, that doesn't mean that allowing ADUs necessarily means that these underlined groups will be able to move into neighborhoods that they can't now. Yes, that would be one outcome. If it feeds speculation, it may also be that these underlined areas, which tend to be correlated, I'll stand by this statement, with income, with lower and moderate incomes, are going to be forced out by their landlords because now the property is worth more. So this issue of income is incredibly tricky because it has to do a little bit with, are you forcing them out or are you letting them in? And again, they affect those groups. They affect all of these groups disproportionately. And it's not a simple answer as to which action is more equitable. So what are the equity inputs? They're potentially separate. I'm going to spend 2 on the main argument. Does zoning for ADUs lead to speculation and displacement? Well, there are 3 cases. I'm going to go back. Oh, sorry. Get my credit over here. Let's go back up. An investor. Don is an investor, and he sees an added value when you add ADUs in this neighborhood. And I say, wow, I could pay more for that property, buy it, redevelop that main house, and build an ADU. And I go hunting, and some existing resident who could be elderly, who could be a person of color, who could be a disabled person, says, you know what? I was just waiting for the offer to come in above X price. You are the first. I am happy to sell. I've wanted to move as soon as I can get enough money out of it. There's a gentrification impact in there, maybe. Hard to see an equity impact. They are a willing seller who wanted to sell their property and are not being dislocated. They want to move in return for selling their house. That happens every day all over America. And we say that is your choice. Investor sees the added value, pays more to buy a property from a non-occupant owner who evicts the tenant. That's our fear. But it's not the only scenario. It's also A is a scenario, and B and C is a scenario. A new household, me and my partner and our young child look and say, we can't afford to move to buy any house. But you know what? We could, if we could borrow in a lower income neighborhood and move there. We intend to raise our family there, but we're going to have to pay, we could pay the mortgage and the ADU, renovating the basement into an ADU. We could do that if we could rent out the basement. So it's not simple. B is the stereotype. B is what we think we're addressing. A is also happening, and C is also happening. So do they lead to speculation and displacement? Depends on which scenario is playing out. Obviously, it depends on the market, but let's be honest. The low-hanging fruit for investors may well be to buy in lower and moderate income neighborhoods, which often has more renters, and to reduce the investment they have to cover to cover their mortgage, apologies for the typo, through the combination of single family and ADU rentals. So if you had to guess, okay, we've allowed ADU in all the R1 neighborhoods in our city, where will they happen? It's the first bullet says probably in the lower and moderate income neighborhoods. The counter argument is, hey, if you did it in a nicer, richer neighborhood, a neighborhood with more trees and with more space, you could build an ADU and charge more for it, because that's going to be millennials working in the tech industry who have a stable job and want to live in a nice neighborhood. They just don't need a lot of space. Those arguments are there. I have to say, I think the first bullet's what happens more often. I haven't seen much evidence of the second. I've heard the argument. I just don't see it happening for a whole variety of reasons very often. What are the equity impacts of ending ADU park requirements? Well, yes, they're great because they reduce the costs of ADUs by a significant amount, and they allow, so I should have started this with good. They are good. But remember, they are selectively good because there are some folks who actually do need a car to live. I mean, there really are, despite our paradigms. And again, who can live in an ADU that doesn't have parking? Those who have more choice, meaning they can live closer to they have choices to live close to workforces or other activities. If you're not factoring in school quality, you have relocation abilities that folks with school don't. That doesn't mean you have to have a car to live in that neighborhood, but basically those, let's consider the quality of schools, those who can work from home, those with more money, those who can ride transit. Those with fewer location choices may need to have more cars, and they may not be able to use an ADU parking. Just realize there's a selection that goes on here. Happens all over the US real estate economy. If you require less parking and they provide less parking, only people who can live with less parking can live there. I do not have any data on this, but I will say, as part of my avocation of looking around in neighborhoods, I believe many moderate income and lower income neighborhoods, not below 30% AMI, but let's say in the 50 to 100% AMI, 40 to 100%, many of those are there's a lot of doubling up, and there are a lot of people who have a lot of cars. So, and you know why? It's not a moral question. The usual answer to having more cars among lower income medium families is, I need them. I need one. I work over here. My wife works over there. My cousin works over there. We're all living together. So just be careful that there's some self-selection. There may be some gentrification going on when you reduce parking impacts. Nevertheless, the net effect is good in terms of affordability. Increasing the size of ADUs, number of people can occupy them, good. Since families with children are among the most underserved right now, you fight to get 2 and 3 bedroom units. So allowing them is probably a very good equity impact. Sometimes it takes more people to pay the rent. That's just true. If you limit it to 2, those 2 people can't make it, but if they had a third, they could make it. And again, this issue of size. We tend to restrict occupancy in America in some communities by size. You can't have more than X unrelated people. Let's be clear, that's not a health and safety regulation in most places. The building codes, the occupancy codes, the fire codes, there are many ways in which we have regulations in America that say that's too many people in that room. It's going to be a fire hazard, and it's going to be a hazard in terms of spreading disease. But that's not zoning in most cases. Most zoning occupancy limits are based on character. So I just want to distinguish in your head. The fact that you eliminate the number limits in terms of character and intended intensity of use does not mean it's a free-for-all and any number of people can live in there, both through nuisance and fire and residential codes. There are other backstops for preventing true overcrowding of areas. Moving age and disability, absolutely a good thing. And again, if you say we're going to allow, if you're going to, on the one hand, broaden the availability of ADUs, and on the other hand, limit who can live in the ADUs, to me, that feels like driving with 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the gas pedal, which my dad told me not to do. What are you trying to do here? Speed up or slow down? So everything is a restriction. I said that at the very beginning. Creating more housing for people and then saying, but we're going to limit the people who can occupy this housing is, in my mind, something you got to scratch your head about, other than income. And I think there is a somewhat strong argument for what if you did what Chicago did and said, we're going to limit these based on income? Good. Because that's why we're having this conversation to begin with. The equity impact would be good in terms of affordability. Now you have increased supply and targeted it towards the people who probably need it most. But, and there's a very big but here, and that is it is difficult to enforce income restrictions. Many smaller and medium communities don't have the capacity to monitor this, and even big cities struggle with this. They're regular, I wouldn't say scandals, but exposés of cities that have failed. This person got a bonus, got a subsidy, got approval by saying that 20% would be at the following AMI level. Guess what? They're not. They didn't do it, and the oversight agency didn't do it. It almost always requires an oversight agency to do it well. So, and I'm surprised at the number of communities that want to talk income restrictions, and then I tell them, you realize somebody's going to have to watch this. Somebody's going to have to monitor or take over the renting and the sale of these units to make sure that you actually are keeping them for the people you wanted to keep them for. That is full-time employees of the city or a contract with a nonprofit. It is a layer of administration. So that's the issue with this and that's why supply siders kind of say, why are you making this so darn hard? Increase supply, don't hire those people, don't monitor the rents and sales, and let the increased supply and diversity of housing sift itself through the economy. The counter argument is, yeah, well, where's your evidence that it does that? Takeaways, I think, is my last slide. So I believe if you look and just scan through and read, I have a lot of Excel spreadsheets in my files from different people who have done research as to, well, let's look at comparison cities. Lots of cities have done this research. I think it is a fair statement to say people are not walking away from this. They're walking towards it. They see it as a valuable contributor to housing supply. More communities are allowing them. Few are narrowing or repealing. I haven't seen an ADU ordinance be repealed. I'm sure somebody will send me a link to somebody that repealed it. I'll stand by the comment anyway. Lots of headlines about people considering them. Lots of headlines about cities that are loosening them. Not a few on tightening them. And to my knowledge, none on repealing them. They're generally getting less restrictive in the ways I just went through. The negative impacts appear to be highly localized. And one of the things that planners scratch their heads over is, there's so much heat over this debate. And yet when you go and try to find a city that regrets doing it or is considering tightening it up, you just don't see those stories on a citywide basis or a neighborhood-wide basis. You get people, individual property owners, wishing their neighbor had not done it. And that's not to minimize that a lot, but again, cities change all the time. The house next to you can be torn down and a house built that you think is darned ugly. And usually you don't have a say in it. This is another one of those things. It is an allowed change that results in a change that is of great import, great impact, or potentially impact to its immediate neighbors. And yet you see these trends, and the trends are because lots of things that happen in a city have sporadic effects on the individuals next to whom they happen. Guess what? That's life. That's a city life. And I think the ADU debate is about whether single-family development neighborhoods should be exempt from that fact of city life. And the answer increasingly around the country is no, they shouldn't be. And again, California being the example, and others, I know we have a number of folks from Maryland and the East Coast here, other states are stepping in too. I think one of the pieces of evidence that it's expanding is watch what happens in some of these states where they're they have a stronger system of state regulation, and what they're seeing, I'll say this and then people will criticize me for it, but what they're seeing is that as the state tries to liberalize housing supply, individual cities and counties try to limit it. They got their foot on the brake. Yeah, okay, we have to do that, but we'll try to do as little of it as possible. And the answer is the state steps in and says, we're tired of it. We're tired of it. You need to allow this. You, meaning just as it is, it's an economic problem of this nation. It's an economic problem of this state, and you are part of it. And you need to be part of the solution. And we're frankly, I'm speaking for state legislators, we're a little tired of people saying they just don't want to be part of the solution. So that's what's happening. So be careful. Last slide I lied, is zoning was designed to exclude people. Zoning was designed, its DNA is exclusion. So often when you write these things, it's ordinances often overregulate. You have to work harder to make zoning work to include, and it only works within the limits of market forces. So just be careful. Every restriction you add increases the likelihood that that ADU will only be able to be done by a person with more money or access to money. So this is something to keep in your mind every time you think about zoning. Zoning wakes up in the morning having been designed to exclude. Don't let that bias turn and determine how you use the zoning power. Think hard about how, if you don't want it to exclude, then use the white bread approach and don't do things you don't need to do. Enough said. I think I've left a little bit of time for questions, so I think I can turn it back over to Michael.
Thanks, Don. And we'll ask you to turn on your camera here. And this is a lot of great information. We've been sort of overwhelmed with questions. So we'll keep you to at least 2:30 Eastern, and maybe ask if you can go an extra 5 or 10 minutes beyond that, so we can address some of the volume of questions that came here. And I'm going to start with one here that came in recently, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if so, the question is from Harold Bally, who's saying, in light of the federal appeals court decisions like Wilmington versus Hill, what is the future of owner occupancy requirements being applied in the creation of new ADU ordinances?
I'm not going to pretend to have, I know of the case. I have not pretended to have read it recently. I don't know the answer to that. on the one hand, I do think that case calls into question whether or not owner occupancy requirements are going to be upheld over time. I do understand that, and I was surprised at the case. On the other hand, I've seen some pretty compelling articles out there that make the point that our system of zoning and land use in America does tend to entrench existing patterns of privilege. And one of the reasons it tends to compound that impact is that in many communities, it is blind with respect to income and ownership. So I do think that if I had to put my finger in the wind and say the case casts more doubt on the enforceability of owner occupancy over time, I also would not be surprised to find cases coming forward saying, look, we are an elected government and we are charged to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people in our community. And our current system of land use regulation, which ignores owner occupancy, does not let us do our job. It doesn't let us adequately protect our citizens with lower income or that do not own property. And we need that authority. There are resort communities that were doing this long before ADUs by saying, look, there's a big difference between somebody living in our community who lives here and somebody who invests here and never lives here. And a lot of those have not been challenged, but some of them have been. And to the best of my knowledge, some of them have been upheld. Why? Because you've got public health and safety and welfare, which forms the rules within which property rights operate. Property rights are not absolute. And that's the job. One of the jobs of government is to define the rules within which the private market and property rights operate and how we change those rules over time. So short answer is, I do think that based on that case, it suggests that owner occupancy may go away. And you heard my list. Some people think it really should go away. If you did, and you could repeal it tomorrow and we get more ADUs. I think there's no doubt about it. The side question is, not very many of those ADUs would be built by the people who live in them now. There'd be a lot of what we've already seen, which is the commoditization of housing, which is the investment market, deciding that owning houses and redeveloping individual houses for investors is a really neat way to diversify your portfolio. So, and I gotta believe that there are gonna be judges who are sensitive to the fact that public health, safety, and welfare needs to not be confused with property rights.
Done. Next question here is from Jessica Bella, who's saying, can you discuss the barriers and role that covenants play in restricting ADUs, and what can cities do to help communities overcome this obstacle?
Good question. So the answer is they're very important, and I've been involved in this debate a lot. What if a city, let's choose one, Kansas City, I'm making it up. What if they allowed ADUs in all their residential districts tomorrow? They said, hey, we've seen the light. We're going to allow this. And here are the restrictions, but frankly, you can all do them. Where would they happen? And I've already made my pitch economically that if you had to guess, it wouldn't be in the rich neighborhoods. It also wouldn't be in neighborhoods that have single family only covenants, because some of those will defend them, some will not. Some are out of date, some have been enforced erratically. The courts will refuse to enforce them. So it's not true that covenants, not every covenant that says single family only is enforceable for those reasons, but some would defend them. And so we've had this debate a lot of times saying, you've just said that all these impacts, that the city's zoning won't work out here because this is a very active neighborhood. They will defend it. They will go to court. Answer is the state legislature, and it usually takes state legislative action. The state legislative action could say the following types of covenants are no longer enforceable through our courts. We have done that after the Civil Rights Act. The federal government did it, and I think every state government did it, saying if you've got a racial covenant, forget it. I can't walk in and tear up that piece of paper and take a highlighter and mark out the racial covenant. I will say this. You've got a piece of paper that purports to be a contract, and when you go to court to enforce that contract, you will not be able to. our courts have been instructed to tell you you need to leave because that's not an enforceable contract. That's how you do it. But it takes usually a state or federal, but a state government action saying we hereby deem in the public interest that these private contracts should not be enforced. We've seen them for all kinds of things. Colorado has some that says covenants against solar collectors can't be enforced because back in 1974, somebody said, I don't want any barriers to solar collectors. You all agree? Okay, fine. They're unenforceable. Backyard clotheslines in some places are unenforceable, bans on backyard clothesline. So the state could prevent it. I have not seen a good example, but I'd love to see one of a city that did it. If a city runs or has a system of courts, municipal courts, that has the ability to enforce or to deal with conflicts about its own laws, like a municipal court system, they could say, we have authority to interpret those before you go to state court, and we're not going to take that case. But that would be a very rare outcome, and it would depend on state law. So it can be done. It has been done. It is hard for a city to do it. Most cities take the position, we're going to do what we're going to do anyway. And a few cities have taken the position that, well, most cities have taken the position. If we say you can do an ADU, we'll give you a building permit for it. We're not going to stop because they threaten to sue you. They're going to actually have to do the laws. We're going to call their bluff. But the upshot is, it is like the more you're covenanted, the more you're middle and high income, the less likely the impacts of ADUs are going to come into your neighborhood.
Okay, thanks, Don. Here's a question from Michael Copeland who says, is there a possible scenario where ADUs could offer a path toward ownership or partial ownership for a renter without subdividing an existing single-family lot? Essentially, can ADUs ever really offer a solution to the missing middle issue for people to enter home ownership, the ability to build capital through real estate?
That's the equity building argument. The easiest, the clearest way is to do it the traditional way, is to let them subdivide. And by the way, I don't want to minimize that argument. I don't think it's winning hearts and it's not winning many hearts and minds yet, but it could well. I'm going to wind up in a discussion about that tomorrow morning. Should we just allow them to be subdivided? So that's the obvious way. Yeah, you could consider, you could have a state law or a use of the condominium or cooperative housing laws used to say that I can't subdivide my property, but through a use, it probably isn't the condo law, but it could be an amendment that makes it a simple, a mini condo. The owner of the property can sell the house, the ADU. Can't sell the lot, but they can sell the house, which appreciates. I can envision that. I've never seen it, but my point is, we have legal tools to allow you to own a square of air in the sky and a common interest in the ground below. It's a very simple form of condo. And could you do it? Sure. It's a matter of legalizing it. But again, there is not, there are different things you can own on your property. Usually the law says you own the house and everything that's on the, you own the lot and the things on the lot, unless somebody else has legal ownership of some of it. So create legal ownership of some of it using a common, you both have a common right to the ground, or the owner of the property has a limited common right to come on the back of the property, but the owner of the ADU has a general right to use and occupy that space. And so they can sell the house, they can sell the ADU, they can sell a pretty exclusive ability to use the land around their house. I think it would be hard to do in basements and attics. So.
Okay, thanks, Don. Next question here is from Michael Philbrick, who's asking, if the primary objective behind ADUs is to increase housing affordability, why would you not want to monitor and ensure that rents for ADUs are maintained at a level that increases affordability? Yes, it's an extra level of administration, but it seems essential or mandatory if you are to achieve the objective.
So I wouldn't say it's mandatory. I think we'll see it be used more often. I think we'll see more places do what Chicago did for 2 or 3 reasons. A, the supply side argument is, even though we all learned economics 101, doesn't seem to be bringing prices and rents down. And that's because of globalization of wages. So if you don't, you do run the risk that you are creating more housing for people that are never going to reach down to the lower income population, and that frankly trickle down ain't going to work fast enough to make a difference. And so is it important? Yeah, I think we're going to see more people doing it. I do mean what I said. Your argument is, shouldn't cities just be willing to bite the bullet and monitor incomes? Yeah, they probably should. And I think they will more in the future. It will take time. It will take expense. It will be imperfect. There'll be misuse. But those cities that do it don't walk away from it, because that's how you keep affordable housing affordable. So I do think, I do agree with that comment. I think both are true. We need housing per se. I do think, I'm not sure every form of ADU should be income restricted. I can see the supply side argument for just smaller houses that are more affordable to the middle of the market. So I would say it's going to happen more often. I had a third thought there, but if I come back to it, if I think about it, I'll come back. The real issue is the time and expense of doing it, of trying to run income regulations.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from one of our colleagues here in Maryland, Sharon Suarez, who's saying, do many jurisdictions do impact analyses prior to proposing ADU legislation? For example, many older transit-friendly town centers are absent schools these days as town councils decide to build new schools out in the next development. Older in-town schools are refurbished as housing or other uses. It's a catch-22. Many ADUs near transit would be great for single-parent households with a couple of school-age kids, but the schools are out on the edges of town. This poses a real problem for no-car approaches and public facility planners.
Yep, I agree. So let me answer that in just a question, but my last thought came on the last one, and it's a good bridge to this question. My third answer to the shouldn't we have a lot more income regulation in ADUs is this: it will result in fewer ADUs being built. I could pass a law saying that you are hereby prohibited from renting the ADU to anybody with more than 50% area median income. Done. A lot of people will decide not to do it. So the supply goes down. That's the question. You have solved the affordability issue at the expense of increasing supply for the rest of the market, because they're not going to do it. There's not enough money in it at that level. And so now the question about impact analyses. I do not think most communities do. They don't require it on an individual rezoning basis. To my knowledge, most communities that do this of any size are pretty thorough in that they review what other communities have done. They kind of do what we did today. What have our neighbors done? What have other medium-sized cities that are auto-oriented or transit-oriented have done? They compare those, they put them in a pot, they go through a public process, and they evaluate it. And I don't think they do it because there are a lot of moving parts. You gave a great one. Schools are not nearby. It would be wonderful to have a single parent family with 2 or 3 kids in an ADU if they could walk to school, but the schools aren't there anyway. Shouldn't we only allow, or should we do an impact and say, hey, this area is not going to be able to be usable by people without cars or people with kids in school? And I think the reason people don't is that it can only reduce the supply. So if we're going to say, well, you meet the lot size, you meet the house size, you meet the income, but frankly, there are no schools nearby, there's no transit nearby, and there's not a grocery store nearby, it's not a good place to have a family. So no, most communities don't do that just because I think they view that it is, okay, so then we don't get an ADU here for what we wanted, family with kids that works. But we also get an ADU for the person who's just entering the labor force as a single person or a couple who doesn't meet those criteria and frankly works on the web and doesn't need to be near transit. So they don't do it in my experience, and that's why they don't do it.
Okay, thanks, Don. Another question here is, with these complicated thickets of rules, how realistic is the argument that ADUs are a good option to quickly solve the housing crisis? Is it even feasible for a middle-class family to build one at an affordable price for rental?
No, they're not going to. Their ADU rules are not going to fix anything quickly. It isn't a silver bullet, and it's not even the biggest bullet. I'm a firm believer that this affordable housing hole is very, very deep, and it keeps being dug deeper, not by our own actions and exclusive zoning, but by the global economy and the fact that jobs can go, many jobs can go many places at whatever wage is the lowest wage you can pay for. It's a structural problem. So we are going to have to use lots of things, upzoning around transit. Sometimes, we haven't talked about it today, 2, 3, and 4 plexes being allowed in single family zones, and ADUs, and a lot of subsidies. This takes money. There's no smoke and mirrors that makes new housing construction today affordable to anybody under 30% AMI or 50% AMI. Somebody, the taxpayer, a nonprofit, a philanthropist, somebody has to pour money on the bottom end of the market. It can't be done through smoke and mirrors. So we're going to use every tool. It is not realistic. It's happening slowly, but I'll say what I said at the beginning. When I started on the Denver Planning Board 6 years ago, we'd see 1 or 2 applications for these rezonings a year. Now we see, I don't know, a huge multiple of that. I bet there were 50 of them last year. So that's 50 units. That's maybe it's 30, maybe it's 40. That's 30, 40, 50 units that are not being subsidized that people can do. If somebody walked in with a multifamily and they said, hey, good news, this guy's going to build 30 new units that are smaller and probably more affordable, we'd say, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Well, this is another way to get those 30 units, 40 units, 50 units. Seattle's volume of ADUs has doubled in the last 4 or 5 years at permits. Denver's has way more than doubled over the past several years. So it's growing. It's part of the puzzle. It is not a fast solution. There are no fast solutions to the affordable housing crisis.
Thank you. So I noticed we're there at the bottom of the hour, but hopefully you can go a little, maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, and we'll wrap up, ask a few more questions. Great. Thank you. Next one here is, some jurisdictions do not allow automatic transfer for special permit use to a new owner without going back for reapproval of the special permit by the new owner. What has been your experience with granting a special permit for an ADU and then the subsequent sale of that property and the ADU?
Well, good question. It's not a topic I have focused on, but I've looked at a bunch of ADU ordinances. First of all, most places don't require a special permit, so you don't find that in most ordinances. Among the ones that do, you're right. Usually, if they have a special permit, it's either personal to this or transferable with the property. My personal feeling is that special permits should be transferable with the property. It's a bad practice. It's like saying your variance can't be transferred with the property. It's trying to zone based on the individual rather than based on the land use impacts. If in fact a special permit is fine for me, then it's fine under the same terms and conditions for the next person down. Trying to make it reapply opens a whole lot of issues, i.e. more complaints from the neighbors, possible biases based on income, background, all kinds of issues. And so it's a bad practice. I think that most places either make special permits transferable or make them not transferable. I believe in many places, special permits, in most places, I would say in general, special permits are transferable. They're not personal to this operator or this owner. And I think it's a better practice to make them transferable. Usually there is not a special rule for ADUs. They just have a citywide or a countywide things. We transfer special permits or we don't transfer special permits, and ADUs get swept up in that general rule.
Okay, thanks, Don. Next question here is, does it make sense to allow an ADU builder or owner to use it for a short-term rental for a limited amount of time, say a certain number of years after construction, or for a certain amount of days or year, like as previous example you had noted, so that the owner can recoup the costs faster, but then make the ADU available to a more permanent residential community in the future? Or does regulating this just become a barrier? Or does it just largely depend on the specific community?
You gave me an out there at the end. It's a specific community, obviously. No, I kind of suspected that question would come in when I gave that answer. I think it would make sense to do. I mean, many communities are struggling. How are we going to deal with ADUs? And after you get through the character of the neighborhood and a lot of other issues and the behavioral trash and act and parties and things like that, after you get through those, the one that really makes people stay up at night is what it's doing to the affordable housing supply. If you let all the stuff that could be occupied by people who are long-term trying to make it work in America and let it be done and let it be rented for people who are on vacation because they got the money to make it in America, that's a problem. And so the STR argument, I think that some cities say you just can't do it. Others say we can because we just can't even imagine how we would regulate it. I think if you could get at it and figure and invest the time to regulate it, it would make some sense. It's kind of like, we'll let you do this for a few years because it's a social good. It is housing supply and you need to pay it off, and you will, and your ability to pay it off faster rather than slower is going to encourage you to do it. So yeah, we'll let you do this for a while, and then there's no reason why a city could not track when the ADU was built, when the STR permit was issued, and say we're not renewing it anymore. I don't think it's a bad idea to consider, but I've never seen it.
Okay, thank you. Next question here, I guess that's kind of a definitional one. What distinguishes an internal ADU from a duplex?
Well, the fact that usually it has to be subordinate to, it can't be sold separately from. I mean, that's the bottom line is it is a second dwelling unit. It's subordinate to, usually, almost always, without some weird exceptions out there. It means it's smaller. It means it has usually a kitchen, a bathroom, toilet. So it is like that. Often the entrance is not a primary entrance. Often it doesn't have parking. As we've said, people are repealing parking standards for it. So that's the doubling of density argument. There will be more people living there. There will be another entrance to that unit, but it will be a smaller unit subject to whatever other restrictions you've put on there. My usual argument when this comes up is, how different is my converting my basement to an ADU and having, quote unquote, doubling the density? Now there's another family living in your basement. Answer is, yeah, in 1995, my parents came out, and then my wife's parents came out, and they occupied the basement, and that was more people coming and going. And the answer usually is, they're your family. Well, we're seeing it all over the country where it's not your family. It's the other people you took in and let them live in the basement because they helped you pay the mortgage. So the question is, in my mind, how is it different than a duplex? It's different for the reasons I said. But the bottom line is, you could have more people living in a single family house now. You could have 5, my wife and I are a 2-person household these days. We could have 2 more people in the basement. We could have 5 unrelated people, period, regardless of whether or not there's an ADU that they live in or not. So that's the short answer. And by the way, most of the ordinances that have been gone down this road, Denver included, have said, okay, your left hand holds a single family neighborhood. Your right hand holds a duplex neighborhood. We hereby define, by action of the city council, a single family neighborhood with an ADU as a single family neighborhood. It's a single family use. You say it's a duplex, all you got to do is get the votes on council and we would define it as a duplex, but we have defined it as a matter of regulation in this pot, and that is very common around the country. So it is a legitimate argument. I won't repeat them all, but the bottom line is, it's in between, and legislatively, many governments have said, and for the good of the people, we're defining it in the single family pot.
Thanks, Don. This is sort of a similar question in that way. From David Severis, who's saying, ADUs are the most recent NIMBY and YIMBY conflict in my neighborhood in Ann Arbor. Any thoughts on how we can use thoughtful governance to negotiate this?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. It is true that this is one of the battlegrounds of NIMBYism and YIMBYism right now. I'm going to give you a cheap answer because it's a very broad question. There needs to be a lot more education. There needs to be a lot more education of residents in both lower income and in higher income neighborhoods about ADUs, the fact that they are subordinate, the fact that they're not sold separately in most cases, and the fact and what purpose they serve here. And that education, to be very honest, needs to be done by somebody who acknowledges the validity of their concerns. They're not going to walk away from their fears that this is change. One of the most effective ways to negotiate it is to admit that those are valid points, and not to insist that they're wrong, to object, and to talk through the relatively limited impacts that this have, the social good that it does, and frankly, the fact that it's a nationwide and a citywide problem. So there's a lot of education that builds on some of the themes I've said here, but I will say this. Usually when I get into a meeting and it's either an echo chamber of people who don't like it, or it's an echo chamber of people who do like it, it's not helpful to send zealots into a neighborhood meeting. It doesn't help. It pisses people off. It helps to have folks lay out the pros and cons. You don't need to persuade the hard objectors. You need to persuade the middle ground who can see that there are two sides of this, and that upon reflection, they're not going to come to the next meeting to object to this. That's what you got to do.
Okay, thank you. I guess our last question here was, we got a couple comments and questions to follow up on that public health and equity strategies for ADU report that you mentioned. Can you speak a little bit more about that, or just maybe send us a link so we can share?
I'd be happy to send you a link. No, it's I just combed through my file of ADU research and found that the quote was helpful, and so I'd be happy to send you a link to it.
Excellent. Okay, well, I appreciate all the questions we received. As usual, we can only get to a fraction of them, and appreciate Don's time today. But just wondering if you've covered a lot of ground today, if you have any sort of closing thoughts for us this afternoon.
No, my closing thoughts are, don't regulate what you don't need to regulate. Be sure that when you have this discussion and you decide under what conditions and in what places you're going to allow ADUs, focus on whether you're focused on shelter, focused on equity building, whether you're focused on affordability, what is the purpose, and then try to apply the fewest barriers that you can that will allow you to get political agreement to the whole thing, because there's a bias towards more regulation rather than less. And over time, we find on these controversial topics, whether it's chickens or ADUs, upon reflection, the things we were afraid of don't happen very often and are hardly worth regulating. So be careful, take a light hand, and remember the bread approach.
Great, thanks, Don. And we'll be recording this. We'll be posting that on our webinar archive page, and then we'll include any links that Don sends us to that page, and we'll be sending out a reminder to everyone who has been here today about how to access that. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar, The Evolving World of ADU Regulations. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Don Elliott for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. And you occasionally hear John on these presentations. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye out on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including two great ones that we have scheduled for next week. The first one being Smart Growth at 25, Looking Forward, Looking Back, which will be the first part of a webinar series on the history and future of smart growth with the National Center for Smart Growth and Garrett Knapp, which will be 1 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, July 13th. And then on Thursday next week, we have the top 5 missing middle housing implementation mistakes and how to avoid them with Dan Parolic, who we've also had previously. Looking forward to seeing Dan again, and hopefully you'll be joining us. With that, I wish you all a great day.